The day I found out my parents had given away every dollar of my college fund, money that had been set aside for me since the day I was born. I was sitting in the financial aid office of my university with a letter in my hands that said my account had a zero balance, not a small balance, not a reduced balance, zero. And the woman across the desk from me, a kind lady named Mrs. Patterson with reading glasses on a beaded chain, looked at me with an expression I will never forget. It was the look people give you when they already know something terrible before you do. She slid a printed statement across the desk and pointed to a date, a withdrawal date from 11 months earlier, and said very quietly, "Honey, this account was closed by the account holders. Both signatures are here." And I looked down at those two signatures and I recognized them immediately. My mother's looping cursive, my father's blocky print. They had closed my college fund without telling me, and they had done it 11 months ago, while I was still in high school, while I was filling out applications, while I was dreaming about my future, and they had never said a single word. That was the beginning, but it was not the worst part. The worst part came 3 weeks later at my grandparents' house at Sunday dinner, when my older sister Danielle, walked in wearing a brand new leather jacket, carrying a designer bag I had seen online for $1,200, and announced that she had just put a deposit down on a new apartment in Nashville. And my parents looked at each other across the table with a look I can only describe as relieved. Like something heavy had been lifted. And I realized in that moment, sitting at that table with a plate of pot roast going cold in front of me, that the money they had taken from me had gone directly to her. My name is Claire. I am 31 years old now. I live in Knoxville, Tennessee. I work as a licensed occupational therapist, and I own a small house with a garden out back where I grow tomatoes every summer. My life is good. It is genuinely, fully, peacefully good, but it did not get that way easily. And it did not get that way without a fight. And before I tell you how it all unfolded, and how my grandfather, a quiet man who almost never raised his voice, changed everything with a single document, I want to ask you to like this video and subscribe to the Revenge Diaries if you enjoy stories about real people facing real betrayal and finding their way to real justice. And I'm curious, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or state in the comments. I always love knowing who's out there listening. Now let me take you back to the beginning. Because to understand what happened, you need to understand my family. And my family, from the outside, looked completely normal. My parents, Robert and Linda Mercer, lived in a 3-bedroom house in a suburb of Chattanooga. My dad worked in insurance. My mom taught elementary school part-time and ran the household the rest of the time. We were not rich, but we were comfortable. We ate dinner together most nights. We went to church on Sundays. We took a family vacation every summer, usually to the same lake house in the Smoky Mountains that my grandparents owned. On the surface, we were exactly the kind of family that people imagine when they think of a normal American upbringing. But there was always something underneath the surface that I could feel but could never quite name when I was young. A current of favoritism so consistent and so ingrained that it had become invisible, the way wallpaper becomes invisible when you have looked at it your whole life. Danielle was 2 years older than me. She was louder than me, more confident, better at performing happiness in the way that made our parents proud. She laughed at my dad's jokes the way he wanted to be laughed at. She called our mom her best friend in a way that made our mom light up like a lamp. And a quieter, more serious, more likely to spend a Friday night reading than performing, existed slightly to the left of center in our family's story. Not ignored, not mistreated in any obvious way, just consistently, subtly, reliably second. My grandfather, Grandpa Gene, as we called him, Eugene Mercer, 74 years old at the time the story starts, a retired civil engineer who had built roads and bridges across East Tennessee for 40 years was the one person in my family who treated me exactly the same as Danielle. Not more, not less, exactly the same. He asked us both about our days with equal interest. He attended both of our school events with equal enthusiasm. He kept our drawings on his refrigerator in equal measure until the paper yellowed and curled at the edges. And when I was 12 years old and I told him I wanted to be a doctor or a therapist or something in medicine that helped people, he looked at me over his reading glasses and said, "Then that is exactly what you will do, Claire Bear. And I will help you get there." He called me Claire Bear. He had called me that since I was 3. No one else in my family used that name. It was his and mine alone. When I was 14, my parents sat both of us down and told us about the college funds. They had opened savings accounts for each of us when we were born, they said, and they had been contributing to them ever since. They had also set up accounts that our grandparents contributed to on birthdays and holidays. By the time I was 14, my fund, they told me, had just over $47,000 in it. Danielle's, because she was 2 years older and would need it sooner, had a similar amount. My mother said very specifically, "This money is for education, for your future. That is what it is there for, and that is what it will be used for." And I believed her. I had no reason not to believe her. I was 14 years old, and my mother was telling me that my future was being protected, and I believed every word. Danielle graduated high school 2 years ahead of me. She enrolled in a state university about 2 hours from home, studied communications, and spent 3 years doing exactly that before quietly dropping out in her junior year. My parents said very little about it publicly. They said she had decided to take a different path. Danielle moved back home, worked at a boutique downtown for about a year, then announced she wanted to move to Nashville to pursue music. She had always sung, she had a genuinely lovely voice, and she had this dream of making something of it. My parents drove her there and helped her move into an apartment. They came home looking proud. And I did not think much about any of it because I was 17, finishing my senior year and entirely focused on my own applications. I got into 3 schools. I chose a university about 90 miles from home, a good program, a solid reputation, a campus I loved when I visited. I was excited in a way that felt almost physical, like something buzzing under my skin. And when I sat in Mrs. Patterson's office that September and the screen showed 0, that buzzing stopped. It stopped like a light going out. I did not call my parents from the office. I drove home. I needed to see their faces when I asked the question. I needed to watch what happened in their eyes. My mother was in the kitchen when I walked in. My father was in his recliner. I walked into the living room and I stood in front of both of them and I said, very calmly, "Can someone explain to me why my college fund has a 0 balance?" And the silence that followed was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of people who have been waiting for a door to open and are not sure whether to run through it or barricade it. My father spoke first. He said they had borrowed from it temporarily for a family situation. He said they had planned to replenish it. He said it was complicated. And my mother said nothing for a long moment, and then she said, "Danielle needed help getting stable, Claire. We couldn't let her fall." I looked at my mother. I looked at my father. And I said very quietly, "What about me?" And my father said, "You're responsible. You'll figure it out. You always do." And I understood then that being capable, being the responsible one, the one who always figured things out, was not a compliment in this family. It was a permission slip to take from me without asking, because surely I would manage. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment. I felt something I did not have a word for at 17. It was not quite anger, though anger came later. It was more like a sudden, dizzying understanding, like looking at a picture you have seen your whole life and suddenly seeing what it actually is, rather than what you assumed it was. I had been second for 17 years without knowing it, and now I knew it. And I could not unknow it. I called my grandfather that night from my bedroom. I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a very long time, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. And then he said, "Claire Bear, you come to Sunday dinner this week. You come and you sit next to me, and you let me think on this." That was all he said. But the way he said it, slow and deliberate, the way he talked when something truly mattered, made something in my chest loosen just slightly, like a window cracking open in a room that had been sealed shut. I went back to school. I applied for financial aid. I got a partial grant and took out loans for the rest, loans that would follow me for the better part of a decade. I worked 20 hours a week at the campus library. I ate cheap. I did not buy new clothes for 2 years. I did what my father said I would do. I figured it out. But I want you to understand something important about figuring it out under those circumstances. Every month when the loan statement came, every time I ate peanut butter for 3 meals in a row, every time I watched other students go on spring break trips I could not afford, I thought about that withdrawal date. I thought about the 11 months they had kept it from me. I thought about Danielle's leather jacket and her Nashville apartment. And I stored all of it somewhere quiet and deep inside myself, and I kept moving. Danielle's music career did not take off the way she had hoped. Nashville is a city that chews through dreams efficiently, and her particular dream did not survive the first 2 years. She moved back to Chattanooga. She lived with my parents for a while. She found a job managing a restaurant, which she was actually quite good at. She and I had a relationship during those years that I would describe as carefully civil. We were polite at family gatherings. We texted occasionally. We were not enemies. But I had built a wall around the part of me that knew what had happened, and I never took it down when she was around. She never acknowledged what had been done, and because she never acknowledged it, I never forgave it. You cannot forgive what someone will not admit to. My parents, during my college years, never once offered to help with the loans. They never asked how I was managing financially. They asked about my grades occasionally. They asked if I had a boyfriend. They treated the college fund situation as a closed chapter, a thing that had happened, been weathered, moved past. And I let them believe that I had moved past it too, because I had learned something important during those years. I had learned the difference between letting go and letting things lie. I had let things lie. I had not let go of anything. Now here is where things shift. Here is where my grandfather enters the story in a way I did not see coming. Even though looking back, I should have understood what he was doing all along. Grandpa Gene had always been methodical. He had built careers on precision, measuring twice, cutting once, never laying a foundation until the ground had been properly assessed. He applied the same approach to everything in his life, including, as I would eventually discover, his estate. He had worked for 40 years and saved carefully. He owned the lake house in the Smokies, a piece of property in the county, his primary residence, and a portfolio of investments that he had managed himself for 30 years with quiet diligence. He was not a wealthy man in the way that word gets thrown around, but he had built something substantial, something that would matter when the time came. I graduated with my master's degree in occupational therapy in May of that year. My graduation ceremony was at 2 in the afternoon on a Saturday. My parents came, Danielle came, my grandmother came, and Grandpa Gene came slowly because his knees had been troubling him for 2 years by then, and he walked with a cane now that he pretended to hate and secretly relied on completely. He sat in the 3rd row and he wore his good blue blazer, and he watched me walk across that stage, and when I looked out at the audience, there were exactly 2 people who were on their feet before I had even received my diploma. My grandmother, because she was always the first to clap for anything, and my grandfather, cane propped against his knee, standing slowly and deliberately in his blue blazer, with an expression on his face that I can only describe as vindicated. He hugged me afterward in the parking lot, right there in the afternoon sun with the crowd moving around us, and he held on longer than usual. And he said very quietly into my hair, "I'm so proud of you, Claire Bear, and I need to talk to you this week. Come to the house on Tuesday." "Come alone." I pulled back and looked at him. "Is everything okay?" He nodded, slowly. "Everything is exactly as it should be," he said. And there was something in his voice, a settled quality, like a man who has completed a task he has been working on for a very long time, that stayed with me all weekend. I went to his house on Tuesday. My grandmother made coffee, and then, in the way she had of understanding when her husband needed privacy for something important, she took her book and went to sit on the back porch. Grandpa Jean sat across from me at the kitchen table, and he placed a manila folder between us, and he folded his hands on top of it, and he looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. He said, "I know what your parents did with your college fund." He said it simply, without preamble, the way he said everything that mattered. I found out 2 years after it happened. "Your Aunt Barbara told me, because she heard your mother mention it at a birthday party, and she thought I should know. And I want you to understand that what I did next, I did carefully and I did privately, because it was my decision to make and I did not want anyone interfering with it before it was done." He opened the folder. Inside was a document, a revised will, dated 14 months earlier, signed and notarized. He pointed to a section near the middle and told me to read it. And I read it, and I read it again. And then I sat back in my chair and I put both hands flat on the table because I needed something solid to hold on to. He had restructured his entire estate. The lake house, the one we had gone to every summer, the one Danielle and I had grown up running through, the one my mother had already started referring to in family conversations as eventually ours, had been placed in a trust designated specifically for me, along with a portion of his investment account that, as of the date of the document, represented more than 3 times the amount that had been taken from my college fund. There were conditions attached. The lake house could not be sold for 10 years so that the family could still use it during my grandmother's lifetime, but the ownership was clear and it was mine. And there was a letter attached in his handwriting that explained his reasoning in the precise and methodical way of a man who had spent a career building things that needed to last. He had written, among other things, "I have watched Claire work for everything she has without complaint and without asking for what should have been given to her. I have watched her be taken from because she was trusted to manage. That is not a quality to be punished. It is a quality to be rewarded. I am repairing as best I can what was taken from her, and I am asking her to forgive the imperfection of the repair, because no document can return the years of difficulty she should not have had to face." I looked up from the letter and my grandfather was watching me with steady eyes. I said, "Do they know?" He said, "They will know when it is time for them to know, not before." And I said, "Why are you telling me now?" He said, "Because I want you to know while I am still here to tell you myself, and because you deserve to know that someone was paying attention." I want to pause here for a moment because this is the part of the story where I usually lose my composure a little when I tell it, even now. Even at 31, with everything resolved and everything settled, the memory of sitting at that kitchen table with my grandfather on a Tuesday morning in June, reading that document, understanding what he had done and when he had done it and why, it gets me every time. Because the thing that was most meaningful was not the money. Though the money mattered, it paid off my loans. It gave me the down payment on my house. It changed the material landscape of my life in ways I am genuinely grateful for. But that was not the most meaningful part. The most meaningful part was the letter. The most meaningful part was being told, in my grandfather's deliberate and specific handwriting, that someone had been paying attention. That the quiet one, the responsible one, the one who figured things out, had been seen. He passed away 16 months later. A heart attack in his sleep in February. My grandmother found him in the morning. It was peaceful, the doctor said, as peaceful as those things can be. We buried him on a Friday in the cemetery behind the church where he and my grandmother had been married 51 years earlier. And the ground was cold, and the sky was that particular shade of winter white that feels like the world holding its breath. I wore the same coat I had worn to my graduation. I stood next to my grandmother and held her hand. I did not cry at the graveside. I had already done my crying privately in the days before, and what I felt standing there was something else entirely, something closer to gratitude than grief, though grief was there too. The will was read 3 weeks later. I was there. My parents were there. Danielle was there. My Aunt Barbara, who had told my grandfather what she had heard at that birthday party and who I had come to think of with enormous warmth because of it, was there. And when the attorney, a quiet man named Mr. Feldman, who had clearly been through many of these rooms with many of these families, read the section about the lake house and the trust, the room changed. I felt it the way you feel a pressure change before a storm. My mother's posture shifted. My father's jaw tightened. Danielle looked at the table. My father said very carefully, "There must be an error." Mr. Feldman said there was no error. My mother said he would not have done this without talking to us first. Mr. Feldman said the document had been prepared, reviewed, and notarized 14 months prior and was entirely legally sound. My Aunt Barbara, sitting 2 chairs away from my mother, said nothing. She looked at her hands. There was a small, controlled expression on her face that I recognized, because I had worn it myself many times over the years. It was the expression of someone who knows something and has been quietly holding it and is now watching the moment when it lands. My father looked at me across the table, and I looked back at him, and I did not say anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. The document said everything. My grandfather's letter, read privately to those named in the will, said everything else. The facts of what had happened, the college fund, the withdrawal, the 11 months of silence, were in that letter in plain language, because my grandfather had wanted it documented. He had wanted the reasoning preserved. He had been precise about it the way he was precise about everything. They contested it. Of course they contested it. My father hired an attorney within 2 weeks and attempted to argue that my grandfather had not been of sound mind when he revised the will. Mr. Feldman's office produced 14 months of documentation, correspondence, signed statements, the notarization records that demonstrated clearly and completely that Eugene Mercer had been entirely and specifically in command of his faculties and his intentions. The challenge was withdrawn 4 months later, not with grace, not with any acknowledgement of wrongdoing or apology, but it was withdrawn, and the trust was finalized. And the lake house became mine. I want to tell you what happened with Danielle, because it is the part of this story that I think about most carefully when I tell it. Danielle called me about 2 months after the will was read. She asked if we could meet for coffee. We met at a place downtown on a Wednesday afternoon, and she looked tired in the way people look when they have been carrying something uncomfortable for too long. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug, and she looked at the table, and she said, "I want you to know that I didn't ask them to use your money." I didn't know that was what they had done until recently. She looked up at me. "I am not asking you to forgive them. I am just asking you to believe that I didn't know." I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about the leather jacket. I thought about the designer bag. I thought about Nashville and the deposit on the apartment. And I thought, because I had had a lot of time to think about this, And because I had been to therapy for 2 years by that point and had done a significant amount of work on exactly this question, I thought about what I actually believed. And what I believed, looking at my sister across that coffee table, was that she was probably telling the truth about not knowing. And I also believed that not knowing is not the same as not benefiting, and that those two things could both be true at the same time, and I could hold both of them without deciding they canceled each other out. I said, I believe you didn't know. And I watched something in her face release, and then I said, but it happened. And the effects of it on my life were real. And I am not going to pretend otherwise. She nodded. She did not argue. And we finished our coffee and we paid our separate checks and we walked out into the afternoon and we have been, since that day, carefully and honestly rebuilding something. Not what we had before, because what we had before was built on a false foundation. Something new. Smaller maybe, but real. My parents and I do not have a close relationship. I want to be honest about that because I think stories like this sometimes get wrapped up too neatly. And I promised you a true story, and the true version is that some things do not fully repair. We see each other at family events. We are civil. My mother once, about a year after the will was settled, said something that I think was the closest she could come to an apology. She said, "We made decisions we thought were right at the time, and I understand now that they hurt you." And I said, yes, they did. And that was as far as it went. It was not enough. But it was what was available. And I chose to accept it for what it was, an acknowledgement, partial and imperfect, of something real, rather than demand a complete reckoning that was never going to come. And I wanted to say something about that because I think it matters. There is a version of revenge that lives entirely in the fantasy of the other person's complete collapse, the full confession, the tearful acknowledgement, the total reckoning. And sometimes that happens, but often it does not. Often the justice available to us is quieter than that. Often it looks like a revised will from a grandfather who paid attention. Often it looks like loans repaid, a house with a garden, a career built entirely on your own effort. Often it looks like sitting across from your sister at a coffee shop and telling the truth and choosing to start something new rather than staying in the wreckage of what was. That is the kind of justice that my grandfather believed in. Not the punishment of the wrongdoer, though consequences did follow naturally and proportionally without anyone having to engineer them, but the protection and restoration of the person who had been wronged, the repair, the recognition, the making right of what could be made right. I think about him often. I think about him most in the summers, when I drive up to the lake house on weekends and I sit on the porch in the evening with a glass of iced tea and watch the light change on the water the way it always has, the way it did when I was 7 years old chasing fireflies in the yard while my grandfather sat in exactly the spot I am sitting in now. The porch boards creak in the same place they always did. The kitchen smells like pine and old wood, and something I cannot name that is just the smell of that place, that specific air. And sometimes, sitting there, I talk to him, quietly, just to the evening and the water and whatever comes after. I say thank you for seeing me, for being methodical about it, for trusting that I would be okay, but also deciding that I should not have to simply manage, for understanding, before I understood it myself, that being the responsible one should never mean being the one who is taken from. And here is what I want to leave you with, because I have been thinking about how to close this story for a while now, and I keep coming back to this. The most powerful thing my grandfather did was not the money. It was the letter. It was the act of writing down, in his own careful handwriting, the specific reasons why he had done what he had done, so that those reasons could not be rewritten, could not be reframed, could not be quietly revised the way so many family stories get quietly revised over time. He made the truth permanent. He gave it the weight of a legal document and the warmth of his own words. He made sure that when the room changed, and he knew it would change, there would be a record of why. A man who built roads and bridges for 40 years understood that what you build needs a foundation that lasts, and so he built me one. He built it 14 months before he needed to. He built it carefully and precisely in private, and when the time came, it held. If you are in a family situation right now where you feel like the one who manages, the one who adjusts, the one who is quietly taken from because everyone trusts you to be fine, I want you to hear this. You are not required to be fine with what is not fine. You are allowed to grieve what was taken from you. You are allowed to name it and document it and tell the truth about it. And you are allowed to rebuild from it, not into bitterness, because bitterness is a weight that belongs to the person who wronged you, not to you, but into something solid and real and entirely your own. That is what I did. That is what Grandpa Gene helped me do. And sitting here today, 31 years old, with my loans paid and my house with the garden and the lake house in the summers, I would not trade the life I built for the easier version. Not because the harder path was better. It was not. It was harder and it was unfair, and it should not have been that way. But because of what I know now about my own strength and about the specific kind of love that shows up not in grand gestures, but in careful, quiet acts of protection from the people who are truly paying attention. Before I go, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want to know. What would you have done? If you had been sitting in that financial aid office and seen that zero balance, knowing what it meant, what would your next step have been? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and conversations in this community are some of the most thoughtful I have ever been part of. And if this story touched you in some way, if it reminded you of something in your own life, or gave you something to think about, please like this video, subscribe to the Revenge Diaries, and share it with someone who might need to hear it today. There are people out there right now who are the responsible one, the one who manages, the one who has been quietly taken from, and sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for someone like that is just show them a story where it turned out okay, where someone was paying attention, where justice, quiet and methodical and real, arrived exactly when it was supposed to. Thank you for being here. I will see you in the next one.